Hi there again, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about pacifism in British politics throughout the 1930s in the run-up to the Second World War. Now, this is distinct from the policy of appeasement. Pacifism was an outright rejection of war and militarism under any circumstances, whereas appeasement was a more tactical policy, and Neville Chamberlain certainly didn't rule out war. And in fact, as David Reynolds in his book The Long Shadow points out, it was Neville Chamberlain who said that ultimately it was highly likely that Hitler would have to be dealt with through force of arms in the end. Well, tonight we're going to look at an excellent book that I've received from Pen and Sword Books, Opposition to the Second World War, Conscience, Resistance and Service in Britain, 1933 to 45, by Dr. John Broome. So, without further ado, we're going to start off by looking at pacifism in the Labour Party during the 1930s. The Labour Party throughout the 1930s was the most politically divided of all the major parties. So, let us have a look. So, John Broome writes, whilst many mainstream politicians could at least give generalised support to the aims of the League of Nations Union without necessarily ascribing to all its stated positions, the issue of pacifism was one that caused deep bitterness and splits within the Labour Party. Keir Hardie, Ramsay MacDonald and other Labour leaders had been outspoken critics of the First World War, and during the early 1930s Labour swung towards pacifism in response to the increasingly jingoistic tone coming from the packed House of Commons benches of the national government. The Labour Party had been reduced to 50 MPs at the 1931 general election as Ramsay MacDonald threw his energies into supporting the national government. This caused a split within the party, which had been since 1906 an amalgamation of the Labour Representation Committee and the Independent Labour Party. So all political parties, it can be said, are kind of coalitions, but the Labour Party, really since its inception, was a kind of like an armada of left of centre and left wing groups. The Independent Labour Party, the Social Democratic Federation under Henry Hindman, and the Labour Representation Committee, which was far more the creature of the creation of the trade unions, and gradually stopped with increasingly more bourgeois and centre ground politicians and far fewer working class representatives, had an uneasy relationship throughout the first 3 decades of the party's life. Labour's official position after 1930, in the aftermath of the 1931 election, was the same as before it. The policy pursued by Henderson and Dalton in the Foreign Office during the Labour administration of 1929 to 31. Officially, the Labour Party stood for multilateral disarmament by negotiated agreement and security on the basis of the League of Nations Covenant. Nevertheless, large sections of the Labour Party were opposed to the use of force under any circumstances. Non-pacifists and pacifists could cautiously agree on an official formula, even though it held out the possibility of the use of force, so long as the danger that force might actually be used remained remote. So, the politics of all parties regarding war and disarmament were fundamentally coloured by the creation of the League of Nations as a result of the Paris Peace Conference. Britain was one of the founding creators of the League of Nations, and with the absence of America in the League and the exclusion of Germany up until 1925, and the refusal of throughout the 1920s of the Soviet Union to participate, the League of Nations had basically Britain and France as the two main powers that were supporting it, and from time to time, particularly over the Abyssinian crisis, undermining it. And Britain had a kind of a special and quite deep connection, both at a political and a wider social level, with the League of Nations. The League of Nations organisation in Great Britain was immensely popular, and its activities towards pacifism and disarmament were widely supported. The reason for this, of course, is that most British people had very long memories of the First World War and wanted to see no repetition of a conflict on that scale. And all British politicians were mindful of the fact that the next war would, as George VI later put it in his fateful speech at the start of the Second World War, war would not be contained to the battlefield. War would involve aerial bombing and would devastate cities, and there would be the possibility, many politicians feared, of poison gas dropped on British cities. So Labour divisions over the possibility of war were contained within a classic political fudge. What politicians love to do, of kind of kicking the can down the road. One part of the party saying no war under any circumstances. The other party, other side of the party saying, well, work towards disarmament, and yet if we can't achieve that and the situation calls for it, then we would have to defend ourselves, arm the country sufficiently, and potentially go to war with, say, Germany. And the way, as it says, of managing to dodge the question is to say, well, we will say no war on our policies of peace. However, the possibility of us being presented with a situation where we're going to have to make tough decisions like that seems inconceivable. And in the mid-1920s, with events like the signing of the Locarno Pact and the gradual stabilisation of Europe, it did seem more and more likely that these are tough decisions that would never have to be made. And of course, 1929, the Wall Street crash changes all of that, and the 1930s are subsequently a decade of turbulence. The questions of Italy's role in Abyssinia, Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, the Spanish Civil War, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and Japan's invasion of Manchuria, and later its invasion of China in 1937, all tear this cosy understanding within the Labour Party apart, because now both sides actually really have to make real-time decisions about what the party's policy actually is. So John Broome writes, with events in Europe and elsewhere, however, this fragile unity quickly collapsed. The threat of military sanctions by member nations against an aggressor, laid down in the League Charter, suddenly acquired a new importance, dividing those who supported it from those who did not. In response to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, some in the Labour Party had urged an economic boycott of Japan. However, purist pacifists in the party believed that this would lead to war, with Japan bombing Chinese ports and the British colony of Hong Kong in retaliation. The proposal from Dr. Alfred Salter, MP, a committed Quaker and pacifist, was to offer opportunities for the surplus Japanese population to emigrate to other countries. Of course, Japanese colonial ambitions in China had inspired much of its violent onslaught against China and its violent seizure of territory. Though the motivations for waging war in China go slightly beyond this, though that's a topic of a different podcast. So the 50 or so MPs in the Labour Party, those that have survived the election that sweeps the national government to power in 1931. And those that haven't thrown a lot in with the national government, Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowdon, are those who did, suddenly face a renewed threat to the party, as over the subject of pacifism, the independent Labour Party members, those who had been in the ILP originally, voted to disaffiliate themselves from the Labour Party. The ILP had 5 MPs in Parliament and was affiliated to the Labour Party, though of course it was never never actually fully incorporated. The ILP was always the kind of the more authentically social democratic left-wing socialist party in Parliament, where the Labour Party was always content perhaps to hug the centre ground that the Liberals, after the First World War, had vacated. The ILP Member of Parliament, Dr. Alfred Salter, was also good friends with George Lansbury, who was the great figure of the left in the Labour Party, one of the party's true, authentically socialist leaders throughout its history. George Lansbury, during a speech whilst campaigning in the Fulham East by-election of 1933, which was a by-election fought exclusively on the question of rearmament, made clear his view on militarism. He said, "I would close every recruiting station, disband the army, and disarm the air force. I would abolish the whole dreadful equipment of war and say to the world, do your worst." This is not the kind of stuff that wins elections in Great Britain, unfortunately. The 1933 Party Conference, under the leadership of Lansbury, whose pacifism was based on long-standing Christian and socialist principles, unanimously adopted a resolution that declared to pledge itself to take no part in war. In addition, the National Executive Committee, which is for those who are unfamiliar with the Labour Party, the National Executive Committee is the most powerful body in the Labour Party. The Parliamentary Party and the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, were directed to take every possible step, including a general strike if necessary, to prevent the outbreak of war. This statement covered, writes John Bloom, a multitude of attitudes, with some seeing it as the long-term aspiration of the world socialist commonwealth, while in the short term some force might have to be used under the guise of collective security of the League of Nations. The same conference also unanimously approved a declaration by the MP Arthur Henderson in support of collective security. So this is something that is not unknown at Labour Party conferences, where the different wings of the party make different pronouncements. One is committed to unilateral disarmament and pacifism, the other to the principle of pragmatic collective security. And there was an inconsistency between these two motions. Leading figures such as Stafford Cripps, a committed Christian who later becomes a Chancellor and one of the Ministers for Aircraft Production during the war in Churchill's government, declared the policy of collective security as being too close to the centre ground and being, and I quote, nothing but the tool of the satiated imperial powers. In the long term, it would prove impossible for the party to reconcile the strong views of those in favour of collective security and those who advocated absolute pacifism. So this is really interesting. The international scene, the changing international scene, was pulling the British Labour Party in two different directions, and Labour wouldn't be the only party to be divided on the question of war. The Conservative Party, as we know, as people are far more familiar with, is divided between war and appeasement, though the questions of appeasement only really emerge later on in the later 1930s with the advent of Chamberlain's shuttle diplomacy. Far too much is made of Winston Churchill as the lone prophet in the wilderness, proclaiming the evils of Hitler. Winston Churchill, whilst not necessarily being a fascist sympathiser, looked upon particularly fascist Italy as being relatively attractive throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. So now what we'll do is, I don't really want to kind of dwell on the Conservatives because there's less sort of interesting stuff to be said there at the moment, though it is worth our while delving back into that one in a separate podcast. I want to look now at the British Union of Fascists, a small and peripheral force in British politics, but one nonetheless that had a significant input into the debates around war and pacifism, though what its leader, Sir Oswald Mosley, was proposing was not so much pacifism as when it comes to Nazi Germany, but collaboration in the regime's crimes. So, John Bloom writes, another political group that opposed the war, although for reasons that differed greatly from the Labour Party and the ILP, was the British Union of Fascists. They argued that a war with Germany was neither ideologically nor strategically necessary. Britain should, they argued, have sympathy with the Third Reich's anti-communist stance. On the 16th of July, 1939, addressing a meeting of 20,000 followers at Earl's Court, its leader, Oswald Mosley, warned, "1 million Britons shall never die in your Jews' quarrel." And here, of course, Mosley was reciting a familiar anti-Semitic trope that really what was happening, the mounting tensions in Europe, were simply trickery and mischief caused by the Jews, pitting one side against another, and the Jews who ran the Soviet Union and the Jews that ran the capitalist powers were, in their own crafty ways, trying to annihilate Aryan Germany and Christian Europe, and all this sort of anti-Semitic hatred and lies, basically. And the one of the things that Mosley liked to talk about was how really the wealth of England or Britain had been stripped away by the Wall Street crash, which was obviously, of course, the fault of Jewish bankers in his prejudiced and conspiratorial view. When war was declared, Mosley issued a message to the British Union of Fascists, urging them to do what they thought was their duty to their country. To our members, my message is plain and clear. Our country is involved in war. Therefore, I ask you to do nothing to injure our country or to help any other power. Our members should do what the law requires of them, and if they are members of any of the forces or services of the Crown, they should obey their orders, and in particular, obey the rules of their service. We have said 100 times that if the life of Britain were threatened, we would fight again. Now, Mosley knew that the war presented his movement with a kind of an insurmountable challenge. The fascists within the British Union of Fascists that were more nationally inclined, who saw their hate-filled fascism as really the defence of flag and nation and empire, were more inclined to want war with Germany, or to at least support the nation during the war with Germany, whereas those who saw themselves as being part of, and this was the minority of Mosley and people like Lord Haw, William Joyce, saw themselves as really the kind of the vanguard of a fascist international, that fascists from Britain and Germany and Italy and other countries were in unison in a war against communism and the Jews, they were the ones who believed that resistance against against the war, and an accommodation with Nazism, where perhaps Mosley was made Prime Minister and Edward VIII was restored to the throne, that this would be the best solution, up until the possibility of German troops being landed on British soil. Mosley continued to campaign for a negotiated peace, opposing the war on the grounds that no British interest was served by intervening in Germany's quarrel with Poland. A famous communist journalist, Claude Cockburn, wrote a pamphlet called The Cliveden Set. He wrote it for the Daily Worker newspaper, and in it he said that there were a number of members of the upper class, including the editor of the Times, Geoffrey Dawson, the Lord Waldorf and Lady Nancy Astor, and other members of the elites, who were meeting at Cliveden House in what it was now Berkshire, and they were meeting there, Buckinghamshire actually, I think it is, I do beg your pardon. They were meeting there to discuss how best to force the government to come to a compromise with Nazi Germany. And indeed this is true. They were meeting at Cliveden House, the Cliveden Set. By about 1939, many of these meetings have come to an end and have accepted the inevitability of war and the desirability of supporting the nation through the war. But their view was that the war would serve the British do them no good, and it would place a grave strain on the empire. And the empire was where many of these members of the gentry and the upper classes, their wealth in terms of investment portfolios, came from. By 1940, the BUF, the British Union of Fascists, had declined in significance, with a membership of around 9,000, and it was easily suppressed by the government, with around 800 fascists imprisoned under the Defence Regulation 18B. Mosley was interned in Brixton Prison in May 1940, and his wife Diana locked up in Holloway weeks later, in a dirty cell, this is from her diaries, with the floor swimming with water and only a thin mattress on a dirty wet floor. One rank-and-file BUF member, John Charmley, argued that such treatment ran contrary to the British tradition of tolerating dissent against wars. This was the first time that opponents had been arrested and imprisoned. Friends of the couple had began a campaign for their freedom, lobbying Churchill, although various society figures, Lord Halifax, the former Foreign Secretary, sought their release. The thing about Mosley was he was no street thug. He was a member of the establishment. He was for the most part, until he founded the BUF, a well-respected member of the elite, the elite social classes. Mosley's case came in front of Herbert Morrison, who was at that time the Home Secretary, the Labour Home Secretary in the wartime coalition government, and Mosley was transferred to Holloway with his wife, where they were both allowed to live in a separate wing of the prison, with female servants and receiving food parcels from their friends. He was released in 1943 on medical grounds and spent the rest of the war under house arrest at a farm in Oxfordshire. The issue of locking up BUF members was taken up in Parliament in November 1940 by the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, the left polar opposite of the BUF. MP John McGovern asked Herbert Morrison, "Is the Home Secretary aware that a considerable number of these people who may have been attracted by the attractive programme of this party are not really fascist in intention, and cannot he speed up the consideration of their applications for a hearing, as some of them have pleaded for months for a hearing, and some young women especially, who I do not believe have any evil intentions towards the state, are lying in prison." So it's interesting that by the time the war is in full swing, and questions of whether or not the war should be fought have become completely redundant, and the weakness of the BUF is really there for all to see, having been so easily suppressed at the start of the war, and the popularity of fascism following waves of fascist bombs dropping on Britain has really declined. It's interesting that the kind of politics that emerge as a result, and the willingness of an ILP MP to speak out in the interests of those who are imprisoned and clearly in his eyes of no great threat whatsoever. Winston Churchill, as a kind of a side note, throughout the war was not convinced that anti-Semitism wouldn't be an issue in Great Britain. Tony Judd and Timothy Snyder, in their brilliant book Thinking the 20th Century, which is interviews by Timothy Snyder with Tony Judd, looked at the question of why the camps, the death camps, Auschwitz, Birkenau, and places such as that, were not bombed by Allied bombers during the war. And the conclusion that Judd comes to, and Timothy Snyder, is that both Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were well aware of the horrors of the camps, but they were also well aware of existing anti-Semitism in Great Britain and in America, and they knew that any attempt to divert the energies of the Royal Air Force or the US Air Force or any other branch of the Allied armies in defence of Jewish interests during the war would arouse the antipathy of anti-Semites and anti-Semitic politicians and organisers in Great Britain, in America, to make ample trouble with at key moments during the war. And so whilst neither politician was indifferent to the fate of the Jews, both of them were aware that there were still anti-Semites in their countries who could present the Second World War as a war fought in the interests of the Jews and distort things in that way. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, and I think, as you noticed, I'm putting out more podcasts at the moment because it really is, during this difficult time when everyone's in lockdown, the very least that I can try to do to keep people engaged and interested in something, and to help relieve our collective sanity until the situation improves. So I hope wherever you are, you're taking care and you're safe and you're looking after yourself, and I'll continue to create as much content as possible to see you through this strange time. Take good care, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.